Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing another guide in the Marvel Contest of Champions, this time featuring Black Widow Deadly Origins. We're going to talk about her skills, her abilities, her pros, her cons, and basically what I think about the champ. This is a rank 3 5-star SIG 200 given to me by the Content Creator Program temporarily. Let's take a quick look at some of her skills here. She's a mercenary, small champ, half decent critical rating, damage rating, not too bad. A little low on the block proficiency, but she does have an evade mechanic, which will be useful. So yeah, she's a pretty cool champ so far. So let's move on from here and take a look at her abilities and see what you think. Evading misses is the first natural ability we'll take a look at. When Black Widow hits into an opponent that is phased or invisible or where she can miss, she gains an evade counter. That evade counter will come into effect if you're not holding block and the opponent attacks you. She will pop out and do something called a flashbang. A flashbang cannot miss and causes no power in the opponent. So this makes her very deadly against champs like Invisible Woman and Guillotine and Ghost. She never really has to worry about getting counter-striked by these particular opponents. Also, if the opponent is still phased, like if you fought Guillotine 2099, you hit into her and miss, you gain the evade charge, Guillotine attacks you back, you do the flashbang, you lose your evade charge, but Guillotine's still set with her phase. You can still go in and reset it once again, so it's a pretty cool ability. Black Widow uses a Baton for her regular attacks. They're energy based and they cause shock. The cool thing about them is their energy damage instead of physical, so you won't take any damage from something like Korg's Thorns. Also, every time you hit the opponent, you have a 40% chance to inflict a shock debuff, dealing 1,827.75 energy damage for 3.65 seconds. This can be enhanced, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and obviously champs that are immune to shock will not be affected by this particular debuff. So next we're going to talk about Widow's Insight. It's a unique ability of Black Widow to learn from her opponent's mistakes. You'll see that little hourglass just below the health bar. That's when she's in the Insight phase. Being in the Insight phase gives you special abilities. Also, the Insight phase, as you strike, you gain stacks up to a maximum of 50. These stacks are very useful for the special 3, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So how do you actually get into this phase and how do you keep it active? So there are 4 different methods to activate Insight. The first one is when the opponent does a full combo. At the end of the combo, you will go into Insight mode. You'll have 0.85 seconds to strike the opponent. As long as you keep on striking the opponent, you will continue to have Insight. You also have these special abilities, which we'll talk about later. Plus, you'll also be gaining stacks. But once you break away from the opponent and stop striking, your Insight will be lost, and you'll have to basically restart it again by one of the 4 methods. So let's move on to the next method. The second method to activate Insight is the dash in. As the opponent dashes in at you, your Insight activates. You should counter his dash with an intercept. That allows you to strike the opponent, and while you're striking the opponent in the Insight phase, you're doing your special abilities, plus you're increasing your stacks. So what's the next method? The third method of activating Insight is after the special attack. You can either block it or evade it. I would suggest evading it because it gives you more time. Because remember, you only have 0.85 seconds to rush in after each method to strike the opponent. Remember, when you're striking the opponent in the Insight phase, you continue to have your Insight last longer. Plus, you get the special abilities from Insight, which we'll talk about later. Plus, you keep on gaining stacks, which is very useful later on with the special 3. So the fourth and final method to activate Insight is when the opponent is recovering from a heavy attack. Here we are in Realm of Legends. We're just going to let Winter Soldier charge up a heavy. We're going to avoid it. It's coming up right here. So we avoid the heavy. The Insight starts. We have 0.85 seconds to rush in and attack. Remember that when you're hitting the opponent, the Insight counter will continue. You'll get to do your special abilities and you'll get to increase your stacks. So that's 4 different methods of activating Insight. You have your combo, you have your intercepting of the dash, you have your special attacks, and you have the recovery of the heavy. And remember, after every single method, you have 0.85 seconds to rush into the opponent. If you missed your timer, your opportunity, you can just do one of the methods again. They don't have to be in order. You can do the same method over and over again. It doesn't matter. So what do the actual Insight abilities actually do? So what benefits do you get while you're in the insight phase? There's actually 5 different benefits. One of them has to do with the special 3, which we'll talk about later. The other 4 have to do with just attacking. If your insight is active, that means your hourglass is active and you're striking the opponent. Light hits increase shock ability accuracy by a flat 60%. Now medium hits reduce defensive ability accuracy by 70%. So you might be able to get by things like Medusa's auto block, Iron Man's armor, rock stacks will not increase as quickly, things like that, which is pretty cool. Heavy hits, 100% chance to inflict a stun debuff for 1.75 seconds, and you have to remember that has to be while your insight is active, so it's kind of tricky. It's very useful for things like Iron Man Infinity War, where he does a heavy attack and you counter with your heavy attack. He does his heavy attack, he goes into insight phase, you do your heavy attack, you go in your insight phase, and then you stun him for 1.75 seconds. The 4th benefit of being in the insight phase is ending a combo has a 100% chance to grant a precision buff, increasing critical rating by 286.36 for 24 seconds, a maximum of 8 stacks. That's a pretty nice ability. As you can see here, every time I go into insight mode, I'm trying to finish with a full combo. You have that little precision buff just below the health bar in the yellow circle. I'm at 3 stacks now. You can get up to 8 stacks and they last for 24 seconds, so it's pretty impressive to increase that critical rating. So let's move on to the next part. So let's take a look at special 1 called Flight of the Arachnid. It actually does 2 things. The last hit inflicts a shock debuff dealing 2,437 energy damage over 13 seconds. The second thing it does is the special attack gains a passive evade, granting 100% chance to evade any basic attack for 6 seconds. After triggering this evade, the effect is removed. Evade will not trigger while blocking. So you get a passive evade, and just remember, you can't be holding your block. It has to be a basic attack. Special attacks will not work. And also, if the opponent has like True Strike or some way to stop your evasion, such as Cold Snap, it will also not work. Before we hit the special 2, I want to talk about another ability called Sabotage. It has to do with her evade. When triggering a evade through any of Black Widow's personal evade abilities, inflict a Sabotage debuff, reducing the defensive ability accuracy by 20% for 6 seconds. Sabotage deals 48.74 direct damage whenever an opponent's defensive abilities fail to trigger. I will take a look here with the Iron Man Infinity War, how it works. Let's take a look at Sabotage in action. We're going to build up to our special 1, release it, and get an evade counter. Then we're going to intentionally let Iron Man Infinity War hit our evade so he can pop out. I forgot that he has a medium attack, and that can't be evaded, but we do evade his second hit. So coming up here, he strikes me here, but I evade the second. I pop out, I do my flashbang. I have a Sabotage debuff on him, that little potion below his health bar. Now watch what happens when I hit him. See how those failed? Those failed are his defensive abilities failing, and he's taking direct damage as he takes those failures. So it's a pretty cool little extra ability. It can be done anytime that you use the evasion, like anytime at all. Also, it can be done with the special 3, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Since we're talking about the Sabotage debuff, it's a good time to talk about the signature ability called Red Room Training, because it actually incorporates with the Sabotage debuffs. It actually does 3 different things. 1, it increases the potency of Sabotage debuffs, increasing direct damage done when abilities fail to trigger by up to 120%. That would be a SIG 200. Also increases the duration of Sabotage debuffs up to 80%, again a SIG 200. And landing hits while Widow's Insight is active, pauses Sabotage debuffs for 0.5 seconds. So again, that makes the Sabotage last a lot longer. So it's a pretty cool signature ability. It gives you a longer Sabotage debuff and it gives you more damage. Do I think it is needed to make this champ a pretty good champ? No, I do not, but I think it would be a very nice bonus to have. So next we're going to take a look at the special 2 called Spider Bite Combination. It actually does 2 things. 1, it deals 4,630.3 as a burst of shock damage when striking shocked opponents. So it sounds like they should already be in a shock phase before you launch it to get that extra burst. But that's very easy to do with Black Widow. Second, if Widow's Insight is active, and I stress this, it has to be active, all hits reduce defensive ability accuracy by 70%. So that's pretty nice. You can really tear up some opponents to reduce their defensive ability like that. Also, the damage of this attack can be enhanced even further if the opponent is suffering from a Sabotage debuff and has a defensive ability that triggers when struck. So you can do a lot of damage on the special 2 if you time it correctly, but definitely try to time it with the Insight. So now we're going to take a look at the special 3 called Dance of the Elusive Black Widow. But before we show you the special, you just have to understand one more thing, and it's about the insight stack counter. Every time that you go into the insight phase, which we talked about earlier with the 4 different methods, which were intercepting a dash attack, when the opponent is recovering from a heavy and you attack back, when the opponent hits you with a combo and you attack right back, and also when you evade or block a special and you rush in and attack the opponent as well. Every time you actually go into the insight phase, you're actually putting up a stack counter. As you see right there, the numbers keep on increasing, and you can go to a maximum of 50 stacks. Those stacks are very important for the special 3, and that's why they're there. So basically what we want to do, we're going to build up to the 50 stacks here, and then we're going to show you what the special actually does. Now you don't have to go to 50 stacks, it's just 50 stacks makes the special 3 the most powerful. So now we're going to launch our special 3. So the special 3 actually does 2 things. The first thing it does is for every 5 stacks of Widow's Insight gained since last activating the special, create a passive cruelty increasing critical damage rating by 430.12 for 30 seconds. Now just a moment ago I mentioned that I basically stacked up my insight to 50 stacks. So after the special 3, 50 stacks divided by 5 stacks equals 10 passive cruelty for 30 seconds, which is pretty sweet. That's 10 passive cruelty buffs. Now if I had 45 up, obviously I'd have 9. If I had 40, I would have 8, and so forth. And after the special 3, it's reset to 0, and then you can start building it back up to do it again on your next special 3. So this is something that's usually used for longer fights, so you can kind of build up your damage. It's pretty sweet, and if you can combine it with your precision buffs from before, you can get some extra damage. Now the second thing the special 3 does is, we talked about a Sabotage debuff earlier in the video. It also inflicts a Sabotage debuff, reducing defensive ability accuracy by 20% for 16 seconds and dealing 48.74 direct damage when the opponent's defensive abilities fail to trigger. So that's also a very nice bonus, Sabotage debuff. I presume that Sabotage debuff will be enhanced by your signature ability as well. So if you want to drop back and take a look at the Sabotage and the signature ability section, that should give you a stronger idea on what that actually does. So let's move on to the synergies. And remember, I'd probably focus on the special 3 more on the longer fights and focus on the special 1, special 2 in the shorter fights. Okay, let's take a look at some of the synergies. Black Widow starts the fight with her passive evade active until triggered. Very nice, it doesn't expire until it's triggered. That means you could use it for 2 things. You could use it for as a protection in case you get hit, or 2, you could actually let the opponent attack you and you could evade out and cause a flashbang and then use your Sabotage. So that's pretty sweet. Red Guardian, while charging a heavy attack, becomes passively unstoppable for 0.6 seconds. Cooldown 10 seconds. Remember Me, each time Black Widow strikes with Widow's Insight active, she gains 2% of a bar of power, which is pretty sweet. Taskmaster, each time he exploits a weakness, Taskmaster has a 30% chance to inflict a Sabotage debuff for 10 seconds, reducing defensive ability accuracy by 20% for 10 seconds and dealing 10% of attack as direct damage. So he's kind of taken an ability from Black Widow and using it for himself. Ronin and Hawkeye, Black Widow reduces the potency of incoming bleed debuffs by 10%. She reduces the potency by additional 10%, so 20% if Ronin or Hawkeye is dead. Not too bad, especially if you plan to be running suicides. This one here I read about earlier. It's kind of funny. When the opponent starts a dash attack or is recovering from a heavy special or a combo-ending attack, gain Widow's Insight for 0.85 seconds. So they're gaining Widow's Insight just like Black Widow's does, except ending a combo with Widow's Insight activates a cruelty buff, increasing critical damage rating by 450 for 12 seconds. Does not stack with duplicate synergies. So it doesn't stack with duplicate heroes, but it does stack in the fight. You can actually make them stack in the fight. I had 4 or 5 of these cruelty buffs up at once. It's not the greatest of synergies though because of who the champs are. So basically you're taking terrible champs and making them a little less terrible. And then the Hulks, all champions gain plus 60 armor rating, plus 3% power gain. Power gain's always nice. And then 115 critical damage rating from these champs right here. Okay, so let's move on from here. So now we're going to talk about some cons on my initial impressions about Black Widow. Number one has to be if the opponent is immune to shock or resistant to shock, or if you're on a debuff immune node. Black Widow relies on her shock attack for almost everything, so if you cannot actually shock the opponent, it's going to be a lot harder to fight for her. Number two, she has no regeneration at all, so no way to increase health. Number three, she's not immune to anything either, so poison, bleed, shock, any damage over time debuff will hurt her. Number four, she does have that evade mechanic, which is very nice and very useful. You just got to remember that champs that have Cold Snap or True Strike will ignore it, so you have to keep that in mind. Her defensive ability, accuracy reduction, 70% is pretty cool at times, like bringing down things, rock stacks and so forth. But sometimes I actually found it confusing because you couldn't rely on it to always actually take the stacks down. So it made it a little more dangerous actually fighting thing. I mean, I'm sure I get used to it a little bit more when I play with her more. Now suicides would have to be a pro and a con. Pro because you can focus on your special 3. Pro because you have all those little shock damages which could be really enhanced by suicides. And obviously the con would be she's not immune to anything, so she will be taking bleed and poison damage. They can be changed a little bit with synergies and with masteries, but definitely you will want to run willpower for sure if you're going to be doing suicides. And lastly, her synergies are okay. There's a couple of better ones. I like the one with Red Guardian. That's very nice. I like the one with Taskmaster, which is pretty nice. The other ones are kind of trashy because they're used on champs that nobody ever really uses. Even Taskmaster isn't used by a lot of people. So synergies are okay. So my final thoughts on Black Widow. I really do want this champ, so obviously that means I think she's pretty cool. I think she's got really cool animation. She flows really well. She's very easy to play. I like her abilities with the shock, the ability to reduce defensive accuracy reduction, the ability to gain cruelty and precision buffs. Just the skill that you have to use to keep that insight going. I find that fun. You always have to be on the attack, always have to be watching to get that insight, to get that extra damage. She's going to be okay with suicides because she has all those shocks. It's just going to be very nice. The only problem is it's going to hurt her in the health department. She's just overall a very fun champ and very fun to play. I definitely would like to get her. Hopefully I'll get lucky if I open a crystal or two. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This will be the end of this one. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and all the good stuff. I have many other player guides in the channel, so make sure to subscribe and check out all the videos. So take care everybody, and we will talk to you guys soon.
Target identified. Analysis complete. Please subscribe.